great journalism. My name's Diane McFarland, and I'm Dean of the College of Journalism and Communications. And tonight, our college and the Graham Center join organizations across the country who will be commemorating the centennial year of the Pulitzer Prizes, considered the most prestigious and coveted award in journalism. We do so tonight with one of America's most esteemed leaders in journalism as our featured guest. The Pulitzers, which are administered at Columbia University, were established by Joseph Pulitzer, a Hungarian-American newspaper publisher who left money to Columbia upon his death in 1911 to establish a school of journalism and the Pulitzer Prizes. Today, the program is guided by a 19-member Pulitzer board composed mainly of leading journalists and news executives from media outlets across the U.S. We are very fortunate to have with us tonight a former chair of the Pulitzer Board and a guardian of one of the finest newspapers in this country. Paul Tash served on the Pulitzer Board from 2005 to 2014 and was elected as chair during his final year on the board when the board launched the Pulitzer Centennial efforts. He is chairman and CEO of the Tampa Bay Times, which has itself won 10 Pulitzers, 9 of them during his tenure with the Times, and has been named a finalist for another 10. In 2009, the Times won 2 prizes in national reporting for PolitiFact, the first digitally based work to receive a Pulitzer, and in feature writing for The Girl in the Window, a story about a girl who had been abandoned by her family within her own home. Paul is a native of South Bend, Indiana, and graduated summa cum laude from Indiana University and magna cum laude with a Bachelor of Laws degree from Edinburgh University in Scotland in 1978. Later that year, he joined the Times as a reporter, and he advanced to city editor, metropolitan editor, Washington bureau chief, and editor of the Times. In addition to being CEO of the newspaper company, he is chairman of the Poynter Institute for Media Studies, a school for journalists and media leaders that owns Times Publishing. He also serves on the board of the Associated Press. As I said, the Times is widely considered one of this country's best newspapers. Until 2012, the newspaper was known as the St. Petersburg Times, but changed its name to reflect its growth throughout the Tampa Bay region. Interviewing Paul tonight is another esteemed journalist, Professor Mike Foley, who is the Hugh Cunningham Professor in Journalism Excellence at UF. Before joining our faculty, Mike spent his newspaper career at the St. Pete Times, rising through the ranks to become city editor, managing editor, executive editor, and vice president of community affairs. He also is a former Pulitzer juror. And here's an interesting note. Mike actually hired Paul in 1978, but I will let him tell you that story. Paul, thank you so much for coming and welcome.
My pleasure.
You've become a pretty impressive guy.
So it seems, much to my surprise.
I met Paul when he was still in school. He was an intern for me when I was city editor. One of his early stories I sent him out on, an intrepid reporter that he was when he became a staff member, I sent him out. There was a school board meeting had run long in Pinellas County. And there was one particularly vocal school board member who was really complaining, "These chairs are so uncomfortable," he said. And so Paul, young reporter, I said, "Why don't you go out and sit in all the public officials' chairs in Pinellas County and tell me which ones are bad, which ones..." And he did, by God. He found out that the judges' chairs were the best, and the school board was indeed the worst. So it's one of those stories I'd never forget about Paul. So anyway, let's start with something very basic, pronunciation. It is Pulitzer, right? Not Pulitzer.
Just as your boss pronounced it, Michael. Absolutely.
I'm really glad to see that, too. So how many Pulitzers are there in a wide variety of categories? How many?
There are 21 Pulitzer Prizes awarded most years. 7 of them are in literature and the performing arts. There are 5 categories of books, 1 in drama and 1 in music, and there are 14 Pulitzers in journalism. The journalism ones range all the way from public service to editorial cartooning. There are 2 prizes in photography and then a variety of reporting prizes.
How does somebody win?
Well, it's very hard. It is very, very hard to win a Pulitzer Prize. And I tell my colleagues, there are 2 things that you must be to win a Pulitzer Prize. First, you have to be good. The work must be excellent. There are some times when I would have given the prize to one piece of work rather than another, but throughout, the work is stunning. But the other thing you have to be is lucky. There is an element of chance in how this works because every Pulitzer entry goes through a two-stage process. First, all the entries in a particular category are reviewed by a jury. Diane mentioned that we had been jurors as well. And the jurors take all that work and narrow it down to 3 finalists in each category. And then the finalists go to the board, and the board reads every finalist and then gathers at Columbia University in April for a wonderful discussion. It's just a terrifically rich couple of days because you've all read the same stuff. And that includes books. It includes sometimes book-length journalism. It includes journalism of a shorter nature, but you've done a lot of reading. So when you gather as a board, you're gathering both with a sense of relief. You know, my semester of reading is over, but also with great anticipation because you get to hear what other people have to think about it. And so out of all that, sometimes there are more, in some categories, there are more than 100 entries. So to be the one that is picked and affirmed by the board is a really rare honor, and so you have to be excellent, but you also have to be lucky.
And those are the secrets to award-winning journalism?
I would say the secrets to award, there are a number of secrets to award-winning journalism. They're not very secret. One is, tell me something I don't know. There's a play, a musical that I think was a finalist for a Pulitzer Prize called In the Heights several years ago, and there's this wonderful number set in a beauty shop, and the women are all talking to each other, the women getting their hair done, and the women doing their hair, and the refrain of the number is, tell me something I don't know. And I thought that's a wonderful metaphor for Pulitzer work. The other thing is, tell me in a way that I can understand. Tell me a story in a way that really engages me and brings me along and gives me some new understanding. One of my favorite Pulitzer Prizes was in feature writing a few years ago, and it was by a guy named Gene Weingarten. Gene has a Florida background. I don't know whether he's particularly associated with the University of Florida or not. He came from the Miami Herald. He was then at the Washington Post. But Gene did a piece about Joshua Bell, one of the great violinists in the world. He's a world-class violinist. And he got Joshua Bell to play at the subway stations in Washington. And he watched the reactions of people as they went past a world-class violinist. It's not some guy with a fiddle. This is Joshua Bell. And then he followed those people and said, do you know who that was? And then he told this wonderful story about how people get caught up in the focus of the daily lives and can miss, the great art or great beauty that is around. It's a little bit of a cliche, but he told that in a fresh new way, and it was a great piece, one of my favorites.
I use that in my class, my feature writing class, because there's video with it. You can find it online. It's pretty easy. There was Pearls Before Breakfast, I think.
I think that's right.
And it was a spectacular. It's really spectacular because he made about $38 in 3 hours. Some people put in pennies, and finally somebody recognized him.
And there was one of my favorite moments from that story is when a parent and child are going past, and the child stops because the child wants to listen. The child recognizes greatness in a way that the responsibilities of adulthood have crowded out. So one of my points about this is it has been probably 7 or 8 years, at least, since that piece won a Pulitzer Prize, and I remember it so vividly because of the great reporting and the great writing that's within it.
It is terrific. He won a second Pulitzer for a
The other one,
far different subject.
very different subject, but during my 9 years on the Pulitzer board, Gene won 2 prizes. The other one is for a heartbreaking piece about parents who forget that their infants are asleep in the car seats in the back and leave them there unwittingly and heartbreakingly to die. And it's a piece about people who are busy, people who forget, people who are out of their normal routines, and we can all feel ourselves in their place. And the horror of recognition when at 11 o'clock in the morning, a wife calls her husband to say, the daycare has just called to inquire whether Susie is sick because she's not at daycare. And that moment when panic rises up from the most visceral places in us, and the father rushes, because it was his day, it was his turn, and he forgot. The routines took over, and he rushes to the car, and the baby is in the seat in the back, and it's a summer day, and it's hot, and the baby is dead. And the frantic efforts to revive. And then, way beyond the story of the emotional trauma and the effort for forgiveness. The effort to get forgiveness and to give oneself forgiveness for that. It's a very affecting piece. So again, it's the power of the great story now several years later that I can remember oh so clearly.
Yeah, he's an amazing guy. And he writes a humor column, a weekly humor column for the Post. All right, are the Pulitzers still a big deal?
Pulitzers, well, judging from the reaction and sometimes the controversy, they're still a very big deal. A few years ago, I mentioned that we give, the Pulitzers give 5 prizes in books, and a few years ago, the board decided that we would not give a prize in fiction this year. Now, whoa. That was a very big deal when the Pulitzer board decided there will be no prize. There will be no Pulitzer Prize this year in fiction. And huge controversy. I mean, imagine in the New York publishing circles where everybody was ready to put that gold seal on their book and line them up in the bookstores. I mean, frankly, one of the great pleasures as a board member, I always got a kick out of going into a bookstore and seeing the books lined up and having the gold seal, winner of the Pulitzer Prize. And I go, damn straight, it's the winner of the Pulitzer Prize. I know about that one. And so that was always a thrill. But this year, there would be no book. And so there was a tremendous outcry about that decision and a lot of complaint about the board. I always told people, you go read the 3 finalists that the jury sent up to us, and then you tell me which one of those we should have given a Pulitzer Prize to. Because it's also the responsibility of the board, not just to say, well, this is the best of what we got, but to adhere to and to uphold a standard throughout. And so occasionally the board doesn't give a prize in a particular category, and there are hard feelings about that. Sometimes there are hard feelings on behalf of the jury that worked very hard or read a lot of stuff to get you 3 finalists, either in books or in drama or in journalism. Too bad. The board has a responsibility, and if the board cannot find consensus, or a majority at least, around any one entry, it has the responsibility to say no prize. And sometimes the controversy is helpful.
It's no secret that the business that you're in, the newspaper business that you're in, has seen better times. I'll put it.
Well, I always tell people this, people ask, how's the newspaper business? I said, well, the newspaper business is actually okay. And they go, like, what are you drinking, And I'll go, no, really, the newspaper business, as in the business of making and selling newspapers, that business is pretty good. I mean, yesterday we probably made and sold at the Tampa Bay Times 350,000 newspapers. That sounds pretty good. The advertising business, on the other hand, that is a very tough business. And the advertising business is a tough business in all kinds of media, but it is certainly a tough business in newspapers, as there are all these different ways for retailers to connect with their customers. Warren Buffett, the business genius and investing tycoon, used to say that newspapers were like the toll booth on the only bridge across the river which divided merchants from their customers. So if the merchants wanted to reach their customers, they had to cross that bridge and they had to pay the newspaper to do it. Well, these days, there are all kinds of bridges. There are all kinds of bridges, ways. Direct mail, cable TV, of course, broadcast, and then this thing called the internet.
Which bad.
Which has had, it's had good and bad effects in our business, but it has certainly disrupted the business model, and the business model not just for us, but for retailers. Think of what is happening now. Walmart is closing stores. Walmart is closing stores because Amazon is eating into them. So that is a very different world than the one where you and I started. And it has had a profound effect not only on those retailers, but also upon the businesses that have always relied heavily on those retailers for advertising. One of the other big categories was employment, job listings. Not so much anymore. And now even Monster, which then partnered with newspapers, is under tremendous pressure itself. Monster's having its own struggles these days. So the advertising business is a tough racket. And because there is a strong connection between the advertising business and the newspaper business, yes, this is no longer an easy business in a nice neighborhood. It used to be that when I first started working in Florida journalism. Publishing a newspaper in Florida was pretty straightforward, pretty easy. Again, the same Mr. Buffett used to say that if your family owned a portfolio of businesses that included a newspaper, the newspaper could safely be left to the management of your idiot brother-in-law. Because even he couldn't screw it up. It's not so easy to screw it. It's not so hard to screw it up anymore.
So has this financial challenge, has that diminished the quality of people submitting entries in the Pulitzer?
I don't think it has diminished the quality of the entries. It has certainly not diminished the quality of the number of entries. Really? It has not diminished the number. It has not diminished the quality of the finalists. and it has not diminished the excellence of the winners. But I don't know whether the same can be said throughout the journalistic depth chart. The stuff at the top is great. It's as great as it ever was. It's hard to choose between them. The juries have a hard time coming to their three finalists. The board has these wonderfully spirited discussions, respectful but spirited, about what are the merits of this entry versus another. But inevitably, I think, there are fewer journalists working at American newspapers today. There are fewer people doing the kind of work that would qualify for entry in the Pulitzer Prizes. I think that means the general body of journalistic work has been diminished, but that which gets to the Pulitzer board is as good as it's ever been.
Glad to hear that. What do the winners get besides recognition?
So, well, first, the recognition is no small thing.
I'm with you.
And people who win a Pulitzer Prize talk about how it affects their life, some of it, how it changes their lives. I mean, you immediately get, if you work for a small paper, you immediately get job offers from the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, and everybody else. I'm told it's very easy to get if you're single, it's very easy to get a date after you've won a Pulitzer Prize. It also, for some people, it creates a sense of a burden. Next time they sit down to write, a city council story, oh my God, I'm a Pulitzer Prize winner now. This has to be special, I mean, it just can't be in a 4-3 vote. The city council did something really stupid yesterday. I mean, it has to be, whoa. And it takes a while to get over that. But to your direct question, in every category except public service, you get $10,000 from the Pulitzer Prize, which is pretty nice recognition. And in the public service category, you get a gold medal.
No money?
It's a gold medal. It's the honor of the thing.
Oh, yeah.
There are other prizes, the Goldsmith, the Selden Ring, that have far bigger cash prizes. Some of those prizes, I think, are $25,000 for investigative reporting. But they need to have big prizes because they're not the Pulitzers. And if you ask most people, would you rather win the Goldsmith and get $25,000 or win a Pulitzer and get 10? It's a pretty easy decision.
And you get that adjective in front of your name for the rest of your life.
Yeah.
The Pulitzer Prize winning writer, Pulitzer Prize winning reporter. I think that's really cool. Do Pulitzer Prize winners have common characteristics, aside from being lucky and good?
Well, I would say the work has some common characteristics that I've described. Sometimes some Pulitzer Prize winners have resilience, because it takes a while for some people to win. I mean, there are the Susan Lucci of the Pulitzer Prizes.
I don't have any idea.
People who have been, it's okay, sorry. Susan Lucci was a soap opera star who always came in second in their version of the Emmys. And she was always the bridesmaid, never the bride. And so there are people who have been Pulitzer finalists a number of times before they actually win. And I remember in my last year, there was an architecture critic of the Philadelphia Inquirer who had been a finalist a number of times, and Ingrid was the winner. And the work, I would say, the work was absolutely better. The work, the entry for the year that she won was better than the entries we'd seen before. But I saw her at the luncheon. There's a luncheon that they do, a wonderful luncheon. at the Low Library in Columbia. It's the big central building on Columbia University's campus. And I saw her and I said, "Congratulations! Such a pleasure." She said, "I never thought it was going to happen. I never thought it would happen." So sometimes they're resilient. I would say they all have done work that is authoritative, is copper-plated, watertight work, and that they have gone to great lengths in the reporting to make it so. And then somehow they've managed, either with an editor or by their own talent, to tell it in a way that is really quite remarkable. One other thing, it all starts with an idea. The most important prerequisite about excellent work is the definition of the idea. Think of a photograph, in the cropping of a photograph, where you really are focusing on what's most important in the photograph. Well, it's the same way in the text categories as well. It is the conception of the idea. I'll give you an example. A couple of years ago, the Fort Lauderdale Sun-Sentinel won the Pulitzer Prize for a series of stories about speeding cops. Not cops who were speeding to get to an accident, not cops who were speeding to stop arrest a bank robber, cops who were speeding because they were late to work or they were impatient to get home. And they were speeding so much and so fast that they were endangering other drivers, including sometimes horrific injuries that were, and some people died in these crashes with cops. It was so bad that the cops in one town were setting speed traps for the cops in another town as they were zooming through. But how do you show that this is really a problem? Well, the Fort Lauderdale Sun-Sentinel said, well, we've got to figure this out. So the first thing they did was that they went out on an overpass with a speed gun. And cars were coming at them, and they were trying to pick out the cop cars, and then it was raining, and you couldn't figure out which car was the cop car and all that. And I refer to that in their reporting process as the moment of, we need a bigger boat. Now, those of you who have seen Jaws will get the reference. We need a bigger boat. But then they did something very clever. They recognized that most of the speeding was on the toll roads. A lot of the speeding was on the toll roads in South Florida. And there are a lot of toll roads, and that these cop cars all had transponders in them for the tolls. So, and that all the different tolls were recorded somewhere in a database. So, as a matter of mathematical logic, if a car, this sounds like your fourth grade math test, if a car passes point A at 12:01 a.m. and passes point 2 at 12:02 a.m., point B at 12:02 a.m., and the distance between point A and point B is 2 miles, what speed is that car going? And the answer, of course, is 120 miles an hour. And so they were able to get all those databases, and they were able then to identify which cars those transponders were in, and which officers were driving, and then they were able to match that up with whether those officers were on duty or not on duty based on their payroll records. And they came up with stacks and stacks of cases where police officers were speeding not in the public interest, but because they were just in a hurry and off duty. And they went into it was a great moment. They go into some poor schlub I think it's the Miami Police Department, and they've got a stack, and they tell the poor, lieutenant, who's the public affairs officer that the cops have sent out to deal with the reporters. And they tell him what they've done, and they go, here's a stack of speeding cases. And he says, well, how many of them are ours? And the reporter says, all of them. All of these are yours. We got a whole batch full of them back there. All of them are yours. So it was in the definition of the story. The Pulitzer board discussions are extremely confidential, and I won't betray any confidence of what's discussed there. But I will speak for myself. There's huge admiration in sort of the clever definition of that story, in the framing of the story, and in the technique to tell it, that they got the goods.
Spectacular stuff. So, and I realize that you are a Renaissance man. You have all sorts of cultured this and cultured that, but what qualifies
This is
you?
a sucker punch coming here.
What qualifies you to decide a Pulitzer Prize in music or poetry or drama? I've seen you dance.
Well, there's not a Pulitzer in dance, by the way. So I would say, a funny thing about the music prize, there was a previous Pulitzer board member who said once that a Pulitzer Prize should not be awarded to any piece of music that you cannot whistle. In which case, there would be no Pulitzer Prize ever in music. And as a Pulitzer board member myself, I noticed that in the poetry category, limericks are often overlooked here. There are very few Pulitzers awarded for limericks. So, look, I would say that a couple things. One is that different board members represent different strengths of experience and credential. So there are, as Diane pointed out, a number of journalists on the board, but there are also some scholars. And the year I left the Pulitzer Prize, we had a playwright on the board as well. And doesn't mean that we defer to them in their judgment, but we do listen carefully when someone is speaking about an area of his or her own expertise. The other thing I would say about this is, and you're right, early on you say, well, what is my particular credential? I think one of the credentials I brought to the Pulitzer Board is the credential of a critic, in the sense of, would I recommend this work, especially this book, to a friend? One of the years I was on the Pulitzer Prize board, my wife and I were in Portland, Oregon, and there's a place in Portland, there's a store in Portland called Powell's, which bills itself as the world's largest independent bookstore. And I was coming down, there's a big rambling building, several buildings put together, and I was coming down a staircase sort of like this, though not nearly so elegant, into a big open area, and up on the wall was a huge green board where it had been carefully written in chalk, this year's winners of the Pulitzer Prizes, and they were listed. And I thought, I was there. I was at the meeting when we decided this year's winners of the Pulitzer Prizes, and our voice has carried across America as a recommendation to the reading public. And that's one of the ways I would think about my job. Is this a book, is this a work, is this a play that I would recommend to a thoughtful, intelligent friend? And so I think that's one of the ways I look at our work.
That actually makes sense.
Well, what do you know?
I want to talk a little bit about a man who came to visit within the last month. He came to speak at Frank, our Public Interest Communications Conference, which has grown exponentially, both in reputation and size over the years. His name is Curt Guyette, and he is a reporter in Michigan, and he did a lot of the legwork, the shoe leather reporting, got it done on the Flint water crisis. He did it, but he's not eligible for the Pulitzer because he does not work for a news organization. He works for the ACLU, which pays him through a Ford Foundation grant. It's maybe, or at least one of the waves of future journalism. Explain that and defend it if you can.
Well, the board has expanded the organizations that are, and the journalists who work for them, who are eligible for Pulitzer Prizes, step by step over some period of time. I mean, ProPublica is not a newspaper. The board went from just newspapers to then newspapers plus other text-based publications, digital news services. The board has recently expanded some categories to include work from magazines. But there's still a lot of work that's good journalism that's not eligible for a Pulitzer Prize. 60 Minutes isn't eligible for a Pulitzer Prize either. They got their own contest. And so, you know, if you want to be in the Pulitzers, you have to be from an organization that is eligible for a Pulitzer Prize. Historically, that has been newspapers in journalism, but it has now been expanded. It is expanding carefully and incrementally. I would say the board is cautious about taking big, long steps in any new direction at any year, because it could be, you know, the board doesn't like just responding to whatever is in fashion or a fad. It tries to be careful and thoughtful about the way it changes its procedures and its rules.
You mentioned the Gene Weingarten piece as one of your favorites. Do you have other favorites?
Well, I also mentioned the work of the Fort Lauderdale Sun-Sentinel. Of course, the Pulitzers that we won are during my time on the board are very much favorites of mine. I sometimes get asked, though, does it help if you were, well, you won 4 Pulitzer Prizes while you were on the board? Did that help? I said, no, clearly not, because if it had helped, we would have won 12 Pulitzer Prizes while I was there, because that's how many finalists we had, or whatever number that is. The way it works is, if you are associated not only with the work, but with an organization that has a finalist, has an entry before either a jury or, in this case, the board, you physically remove yourself from the conversation, from the room where the discussion is going on. And those recusals are known in advance and listed on the agenda. And so while the work from in our case, the Tampa Bay Times was up for consideration in a category, I would be out in the hallway. It was sort of like, some people in the crowd will remember these days. In the old days, before daddies were allowed into the delivery room, I mean, sort of waiting for the baby to be born. In this case, you're sort of out pacing in the hallway, but only one of the 3 of you is going to get the baby. And so after a while, the board would reach a decision. You could always tell whether it broke your way or not. If it broke your way, one of your fellow board members would come out to congratulate you and welcome you back into the room. If it didn't break your way, they'd send a staff member out so you can come in. So I would say among my favorites in the literary categories, I have a number of books that I still recommend to people. Sometimes the books I recommend to people were the finalists and not the winners, because it just, it wasn't the decision that I would have made if left to my own devices. But that's the strength of the process, is that the board comes to a collective decision.
By the way, I'm not going to be the only questioner tonight. I'm about to give you a chance now to ask some questions from the audience. I got a couple more that I want to get to but be thinking about what you might want to ask this esteemed journalist who used to be an intern for me. Years and years. Does the Pulitzer Board ever make a mistake?
Well, the Pulitzer Board make a mistake. In 9 years when I was there, there was only one prize we awarded. I sort of wondered, well, how did that happen? Only one. And so that's 9 years times 21 prizes. Only once out of that time did I think, and, you know, occasionally there'll be a board member who will register a dissent, you know, pronounced dissent with a decision that we're about to reach. But in terms of actually making a mistake, the Pulitzer Prize to Janet Cook of the Washington Post was returned by the Washington Post when it became clear that she made up the story that won the Pulitzer Prize. So did the board make a mistake in giving it the prize? I don't know. The Post gave it back. I would say the board's record on recognizing excellence, both in literature, the literary arts, and journalism, is pretty good. You know, if you look back through the Pulitzer Prize winners over the years, it's remarkable some of the names that you find there, and the work that is being recognized is held up extraordinarily well through time.
Despite the money situation, the Tampa Bay Times is still doing a lot of really terrific in-depth journalism. The thing that comes to mind instantly, and is just eligible this year, is Failure Factories. Has that been nominated? I wouldn't.
So Failure Factories was a work of some of my colleagues to document in really exquisite and in sometimes heartbreaking detail how the Pinellas County School Board abandoned 5 local elementary schools to resegregation. 5 elementary schools within some of them within walking distance of the the Tampa Bay Times building, and how those schools became, again, overwhelmingly poor. I saw one of the photos from one of the school of the first day of class showed all the kids in the school cafeteria getting the talk about standards of behavior. I didn't see a single white face, not one white face, among all those kids. And, you know, I thought to myself, wow, this is 2015 when the photo was taken, not 1954. And anyway, so the schools quickly resegregated when the school board stopped busing for integration. And these 5 elementary schools were certainly 5 of the worst 15 in the state by any measure of achievement, and arguably the 5 worst. And even adjusting, I think what made this story powerful, was that even adjusting for the economic and cultural circumstances of the schools and the school populations, the students at those schools were achieving at a much lower level than students at comparable schools with similar challenges in other parts of the state, and worse than the schools in Hillsborough County, the similar schools in Hillsborough County. And there were some heartbreaking. So it was this very authoritative report based on the data, but it also had the wonderful human story in it. So reporters had talked. They just hadn't sat at their desk, you know, massaging all this data and putting out a term paper, they told me a story, as a reader, they told me a story. They told me a story of one kid whose mother prays with him every morning before he goes to school for his safe return from school. They told the story of one girl who had been, the only way, she'd been a fifth grader who'd been sexually taunted by some boys in her class, and the solution of the school was to give her a 15-minute head start on the way home at the end of the school day. That was the answer. It told the story of a family with two sons, one who needed special care because he was developmentally challenged, and another son who was not challenged, but they had moved from Orlando to St. Petersburg, so that the kid who was the son who was challenged could receive the care he needed at All Children's Johns Hopkins Hospital. But by doing so, the other son, the brother, was assigned to one of these failure factories, and it was the Sophie's choice of the mother about which son's interest do I advance, because I can't serve both. And they ultimately wound up moving, which meant that the boy with challenges couldn't really get the care he needed.
Terrific pieces. I recommend it highly. It's just readable. It's heartbreaking, but it's absolutely brilliantly done.
Well, I had, on behalf of those who deserve the kind words, I accept them. Thanks very much. So will that work be up for a Pulitzer Prize this year? Well, it was certainly nominated. It goes through the same process I described earlier. It goes to a jury among many others that will decide among all the entries whether that one goes up to the board, and then if it does go to the board, then the board will decide.
All right, I have two more questions for me. The first one is, tomorrow is Election Day in the state of Florida.
What a world we live in!
It's been an unusual time, unusual candidates, perhaps. What's your take as a veteran journalist and newspaper executive? What's your take?
Well, what makes this story so compelling, sort of like a train wreck is compelling, but what makes this story so compelling is that it's off script. You know, a lot of politics are scripted. What a surprise. That's an insight. Boy, aren't you glad you came to hear me tonight? But a lot of politics are so scripted and carefully scripted that when it goes off script, it's fascinating to watch because nobody really knows, because they really have to try to decide, this isn't in the playbook. And this year, certainly on the Republican side and to some extent on the Democratic side, man, we are way off script. We are way off script. Think about what the script was. The script was it was going to be Hillary, it still might be Hillary versus Jeb. And the Florida legislature set this up so that it would help Jeb. Tomorrow, under the Republican Party rules, is the first day that a primary can be winner take all in the delegates. And the Florida legislature thought, well, Jeb's going to run. Jeb would be a fine president. We're Republicans. We control the legislature. We're going to set our primary on March 15th, and that'll help old Jeb, who we so admire and would like to be president. And if it doesn't help him, it'll help Marco Rubio, the other local guy. And so we'll make it on March 15th. It's not going to be either one of those guys, apparently. It's certainly not going to be Jeb. Done. And it's shocking to me that Trump's insults to Jeb about Jeb stuck. You know, that he's a low energy. Anybody who knows Jeb Bush knows that he's like frenetically energetic. On the day of his brother's second inaugural, I sent him an email on something that was completely trivial and could have waited. And that night, I think between the Maryland ball and the Virginia ball, I got an answer back from him. So he's anything but low energy. So, but he's out. Looks like Rubio is at the Rubicon tomorrow and will not be coming back. So it is just fascinating. It's a little scary. As a citizen, I would say it's a little scary because it feels like things are sort of out of control. I mean, I watched that debate or that Trump rally from Chicago the other night, and I thought, whoa, this is closer to the edge than I thought. You know, and a lot of people thought, well, you know, Trump, it'd be fun. You know, I mean, let's shake things up a little bit. Maybe. As I remember, though, what my dad and uncles used to say to us boys when we were roughhousing. It's all fun and games till somebody gets hurt, you know. So we'll see what happens here. You know, it is a resilient country.
Thank God for that. And then my last question, and then we're going to turn it over to you guys. We got a number of young people in the audience, students who are probably concerned about their futures. I'm concerned about their futures, that's for sure.
Your parents are concerned about your future.
I've seen their work, but what advice would you give them if they want a career in journalism or want to find a job?
Well, I mean, you're right. It's a very different world than the world that you and I entered in our 20s in terms of employment. But I still think that some of the things that were true then are still true now. One, if you love it, do it. But do it only if you love it. You know, I never got into this business because I thought I was going to make a fortune at it. I got into it because I liked it. I've done well. The world has been very good to me. I have nothing to complain. A little kid from South Bend, Indiana, whose parents were school teachers, and they didn't know what a reporter did. And they were probably a little concerned about, what are you going to do? My dad would have much preferred, I'm sure, that I'd become an engineer. You know, he knows what that does. But they were very supportive. So if you love it, do it. It's going to be a demanding world. It's going to be an uncertain world. It's going to be a world where you have to adapt and change as you go along. What other word do you get to ask snotty, impertinent questions to people who are powerful, and you get to do something new every day, and you get to go find out new stuff, and you get to tell stories. You'll tell them in all different kinds of ways, 140 characters, you know, you'll tell them in all different kinds of ways. But if you love it, do it.
Good advice. All right, the floor is open. I have a question over there already. She'll bring the microphone over. Actually, you come up to the microphone, please.
That's what they all say.
Please come to the microphone and speak into it because it's being streamed and recorded.
Ooh, I'm live. Holy Toledo, I'm live. How do you notify the winners? And when one of the winners is your employee, do you call her up later that night and, hey, congratulations? How do you deal with that amazing news or that amazing story?
So the official answer is that winners find out when the prizes are announced, and they are announced at Columbia University at 3 o'clock on the Monday afternoon following the board's meeting the previous Thursday and Friday. they have a press conference, and the AP moves the story about who has won, and some people actually find out that way that they've won a Pulitzer Prize. Some people find out, not even, some of the authors say, and I believe them, that they find out that they've won a Pulitzer Prize not even knowing that they were a finalist, because the finalists are secret as well until the board announces the winners and also the finalists. Now, if you work at an organization where you get the word that, you know, it could be a good day for you Monday, you might want to be at work at 3 o'clock on Monday afternoon, and, you know, somebody might have ordered a cake, and there might be some champagne in the newsroom at 3 o'clock on Monday afternoon. then you know, but you are, you know, it would be very poor form to have any breach of the news in the meantime. So.
Good afternoon. My name is Robert Mounts, and my question goes to the relative quality of investigative journalism today compared with, let's say, 40 years ago when your outstanding reporter, Pulitzer Prize winning reporter, Martin Dykman, was covering the state capitol. At that time, it seemed to me that the paper had enough patience to allow him to pursue a story over several months, if not longer. And he was able to build relationships of trust with key people like the General Counsel to Governor Askew and to others, clerks at the Supreme Court. It was a very difficult time, as you may recall, for Florida. We had 3 members of the Florida Cabinet under investigation, 3 members of the Florida Supreme Court. The Lieutenant Governor, Tom Adams, was censured by the House of Representatives, and his work was outstanding in part because he was able to hold the story and share information in order to get the whole story and then publish when the time was right. Is that even possible today?
Well, I would say then, I don't know particularly the context for all of Martin's work. Mike was Martin's editor for a while and might have a little better sense of it. But I would say the competitive pressures these days are very high. The other thing I would say, though, is that sometimes in investigative reporting, waiting to have it all and put it all forward at one time is not the only way to go. And that often having a piece of telling an important chapter of a story then helps bring forth more information, which in one story builds on the next. For example, one of my favorite story as an editor, my favorite work as an editor of all time, and it was a Pulitzer finalist, not a winner, sadly, involved a scandal in the National Baptist Convention, which was the largest African-American denomination in the country, or so it said. And that story came to light when the president's of a minister's wife, the minister was from St. Petersburg, set fire to a house that he owned secretly and was living with another woman. When she found out about it,
Terrific piece.
she and so it started with a fire, and one thing led to another, and the story, it was investigative reporting, and the stories built on each other as one revelation led to a next, and people who knew about another part of the story would then be in touch with our reporters. So yes, it's a different world than it was 40 years ago, but then as now, there are different ways to approach this, and sometimes waiting till you have perfect truth means that you have limited not only your own ability to tell the story as you go along, but has also limited the information that you'll get because people don't know what you're working on. So there are different ways to go at it. On the general question of the state of investigative reporting, I think there's a lot of investigative reporting going on now.
My name is Ananya. Does news on social media, as opposed to traditional media, disturb you or excite you in terms of excellence in journalism today?
Well, it depends on the quality of the work. If it's good work, it's good work no matter where it is. And social media clearly helps direct people to good work wherever it's published. PolitiFact was the first digitally based news report to win a Pulitzer Prize. And a lot of the PolitiFact traffic comes from social media. So, if Facebook and Google and Yahoo do great work, then it's great work, independent of where it's published. But just all these new routes exist for us to reach readers and for them to connect with each other.
Hi, I'm Bob Holt. I'm a professor of biology here at the university.
Oh, this is somebody who really knows something. Unlike the journalist, in the sciences, you really have to know stuff.
Well, I'm going to be thinking by analogy here. So scientists get grants from the National Science Foundation, National Institutes of Health, and so forth. And those grants go in to the foundation, the institute, and there's a panel that program officers have chosen. And then they pick out a very few from this long list of potential awardees. So it's analogous to choosing one Pulitzer Prize for, say, fiction. And NSF did a study some years ago where they comprised two panels of people, all of whom were distinguished in their own way, but different sets of people, and then they gave them the same proposals to read. And there was a correlation among them, but it was not one-to-one. They didn't pick out the top 2 or 3 proposals. The correlation was about 60%. So there's some predictability, a lot of chance, a lot of randomness determined by who exactly got on the panel. So my question to you is, what determines who sits on the jury and the board that makes these decisions? Because there's some chance element, I'm sure, here.
Great question. Great question. On the juries are picked by, invited by the administrator of the prizes, who is the chief staff person, in consultation with the board. So the board would say, this would be a terrific juror, that person would be a terrific juror. And then the list of jurors is presented to the board, and the board will bless it or make some revisions. But the board itself is a self-perpetuating board. So on the board, there can be one, sometimes 2 or 3 vacancies in any given year. That Diane mentioned there are about 18 or 19 members. That average 9-year term limits. That averages out to about 2 a year. It's a self-perpetuating board. There is a committee that then puts forward candidates. Candidates do not know they are being put forward. You don't apply to be on the Pulitzer board. You are selected for it. There are certain requirements and limits. For example, there are no 2 members from the same company or from the same institution on the board. So, for example, let's take a big newspaper chain like Gannett, there could only be 1 member of the board from who represents Gannett or who works for Gannett. And if you think about that, one of the reasons is for recusals. So if a Gannett newspaper had a piece up, then anybody who works anywhere in the Gannett organization would have to leave, and it starts to diminish your quorum, your discussion. So I didn't know, for example, that I was being considered for the Pulitzer Prize board. I was home on a Sunday afternoon in November one time, with sort of having a nap with one eye closed and the other eye on a Bucks game on TV, and the phone rang and at the house, and I got to answer. I never answer the phone. I only answer the phone if I'm alone, because at that time I had 2 teenage daughters at home, and the phone was always for somebody else. But since they're out, I got to answer the phone because it might be one of them, and they might need me. So, Dad, what's the limit on the credit card? That kind of need me. So I answered the phone. I go, hello, and it was a man. He said, is this Paul Tash from the St. Petersburg Times? Now, on a Sunday afternoon, that's a sort of a dangerous question, because it usually means my paper didn't get here, or you chowderheads have screwed up another editorial, or it's often not good. But because I'm in the book, and if there even is a phone book anymore, but I was in the book then, and so I said, well, yes, I am. And he said, well, this is Henry Louis Gates from Harvard, and I'm the chairman of the Pulitzer Prize Board, and it's my pleasure to say that you've been elected to the Pulitzer Board, and I hope you'll accept. I said, oh, I accept. Absolutely, I accept. He said, well, that's great. Sid Gisler, who was then the administrator, will be in touch with you. So I hung up the phone, and there's nobody to tell, because they're all out, except the dogs. And the dogs are looking up, expectantly, Hey, boys, good news, So that's how it goes. But back to my point, I'm really filibustering here, I'm sorry. But back to my point about how to win a Pulitzer Prize, you have to be lucky as well as good. And think about that in terms of on a jury particularly, as the work is coming through, and you may have more than 100 entries in a category. And which juror picked it up first? And did that juror like it or not, and therefore set a tone for the others who are going to read it? Did the work find an advocate or a detractor in its first reading? Did a juror get to it on the first day of reading, on the morning when they were still fresh? Or did they get to it on the second day of reading at 3:30 in the afternoon when it's starting to get, oh my God, we got to get through all this stuff and we have to be done by tomorrow? So the cards have to fall your way. I mean luck, as in Eureka, you entered the Pulitzer Prizes and you won the lottery, because it doesn't work like that. You have to be excellent. But I have seen good work. I've known about good work that didn't make it to the board. That year that we gave no prize in fiction, that was not a decision that there was no book published that year that was worthy of a Pulitzer Prize in fiction. It was a judgment that none of the 3 books that got to us on the board merited a Pulitzer Prize in fiction. And so there is that element to the process.
All right, we got time probably for one more.
I'm just curious, why do you think those 3 books did not merit being chosen?
Well, I can't speak for the other board members. The 3 books that year were Swamplandia, a novel, which started out like a house on fire, but for my money, sort of became disheveled. I'm speaking only as one board member here, okay? I'm speaking as Paul Tash, reader. I'm not speaking for the board. The second book that year was, I'm blanking on the name, Train something, which had actually been published some years previously.
Train spotting?
No. It had actually been published some years previously. And the third book was, I'm not going to get the name quite right, was by a guy who had started work on it before he committed suicide, and had been David, David Foster Wallace, and had really been assembled, was discovered or was collected up after he committed suicide, and was put forward as his work, totally unfinished. It was presented as an unfinished novel, very unfinished in my view. And the editor had played a greater or lesser role in the work. Now, the board can decide, remember what a board's decision is. A board's decision is, does any one of these three works collect a majority of the votes on the board? Because you have to have a majority. There's a rich discussion. The chair leads, the chair conducts a very rich discussion. And then we'll call for, after it has gone on for some time, and is there anything more to say, is somebody going to make a motion? And the procedure is that someone will nominate one of the three finalists in any of these categories for a Pulitzer Prize, and then is there a second? Yes, a second. Is anybody not voting? And sometimes a board member will say, I'm not going to vote in this category, but it's rare. So they know how many people are voting, either people who have listened to the conversation have chosen not to vote in a category or recused, because they're connected to the work somehow. And you have to have a majority of those voting. And so the chair will call, well, for a show of hands. And people sit around the table and hands go in the air. It's not, it is secret to the world, but not to each other, about what the decision is. So, and you'll see, well, there are, let's say it's 19, there are 3 votes. The motion fails. Anybody want to make a second motion? Somebody will nominate something else, make a motion for something else. Is a second? Show of hands, not a majority. So sometimes initially the board can have trouble getting to a majority just because different people like different things and are unwilling to move in favor of their second choice to go achieve a majority. But that I've never seen that stop the board from awarding a prize. Eventually you get to a prize. But sometimes if nothing, and it happens in other categories as well sometimes, if nothing is going to achieve a majority, the board will vote no prize in this. And that's after really, I think, considering all the alternatives. In my view, that's a decision, again, only for myself, not for the board. I have a tremendous respect for the board and for the process. But in my view, none of those 3 books merited the Pulitzer Prize in fiction that year. Now, there are years in which I am terrifically enthusiastic about a Pulitzer Prize in fiction. There are years in which, and sometimes years when I think this work is really going to stand up over time. And there are years when I think, oh, that's a good book, and that deserved a prize. But in that year, my judgment, and it was that I think it was ended in the result, was that, again, not that there was no book worthy, no work of fiction worthy of a Pulitzer Prize, but none of the 3 books that the jury put forward deserved a Pulitzer Prize. Good, great. I get a lot of fun out of it too. And now that I'm off the board, I look forward to seeing those announcements. And I take that as a recommendation from my friends and former colleagues. Hey, Tash, you ought to have a look at this.
All right, ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for coming out tonight. And thank you, Mr. Teague. And good luck in this year's Pulitzer Prize.
Thanks very much. Great to be with you tonight.